The silence was the first insult. Usually, arrival was heralded by the screaming of atmospheric friction, the tectonic shudder of impact, and then, inevitably, the groveling of a subjugated populace. But here, inside the sphere, the silence was heavy, sticky, and hot. The prince opened his eyes. The red interior lighting of the pod pulsed with a dying, erratic rhythm. He tasted copper on his tongue, blood, likely his own, bitten during the crash. He reached up, his gloved hand trembling with a spasm of residual shock, and wiped his mouth. He looked at the white leather. It was smeared with a dark crimson streak. "Report," he rasped. His voice sounded small in the confined space. The console remained dark. No diagnostics, no star charts, no connection to the central freezer force network. Just the cooling tick-tick-tick of the hull contracting. With a snarl of irritation, he punched the manual release. The explosive bolts fired with a dull thud, and the spherical door hissed open, dumping a pressurized cloud of white steam into the world outside. The prince floated out, boots hovering inches above the metal lip of the crater he had dug with his own arrival. He expected a city. He expected an army. Instead, he was greeted by a color he detested, a sickly luminescent green. The air was thick, heavy with a particulate haze that clung to his armor like grease. He inhaled and his lungs seized. It wasn't just smoke, it was a flavor. Metallic, rotten, old. It tasted like a battery cracked open and left to bleed into the dirt. He floated higher, cresting the lip of the impact crater. The landscape stretched out before him, a broken jaw of a world. The earth was scorched glass and pulverized concrete, rolling away into a fog that obscured the horizon. Twisted skeletons of steel trees, no, buildings, poked through the haze like ribs. "Barren," he muttered, the word tasting of ash. "A dead rock." He closed his eyes, reaching out with his senses, seeking the signature of life. He needed to find the dominant power level, crush it, and demand a repair crew. He pushed his awareness outward. Hiss. He recoiled physically, his brow furrowing. It wasn't silence. It was noise. A wall of static. Usually, life forces appeared in his mind's eye like flames. Some flickering candles, some roaring bonfires. But here, the very air hummed with a chaotic, biting frequency. It was like trying to listen to a whisper in a hurricane of broken glass. The background radiation wasn't just matter. It was energy, wild and uncontrolled, scrambling his ability to lock onto anything distinct. "Useless," he spat. Movement to his left. The prince turned his head slowly, his neck cracking. Emerging from the green fog were shapes, humanoid, but barely. Their skin was the texture of melted wax, hanging in sheets from exposed muscle. They shambled with a jerky, mindless gait, mouths hanging open in silent screams. They didn't register on his senses. They felt like holes in the world, empty, dead air. Feral ghouls. One of them saw him. It shrieked, a wet, gurgling sound, and broke into a sprint. The others followed, a pack of rotting dogs chasing a scent. The prince didn't raise his guard. He didn't shift his stance. He simply watched them come, his expression curling into a sneer of profound disappointment. "Is this the welcoming committee?" The lead creature lunged, its claws elongated and caked with black grime. It aimed for his throat. The prince didn't move his feet. He merely twitched 2 fingers of his right hand. A beam of pure white-blue light, no thicker than a pencil, pierced the creature's skull. There was no explosion, just a cauterized hole. The ghoul dropped mid-leap, its momentum carrying it to skid across the glassy dirt, coming to a rest at the prince's white boot. The others didn't stop. They lacked the intelligence to fear him. "Vermin," the prince sighed. He raised his palm, fingers splayed. He didn't bother to gather his key. He simply let the excess frustration vent. A shockwave of invisible force erupted from his hand. It wasn't a beam, but a wall of pressure. It hit the pack of ghouls and atomized them. Flesh was stripped from bone, bone was ground to dust, and dust was scattered into the green wind. Silence returned. He looked down at the one corpse he had left intact near his boot. He kicked it over. The face was a ruin of radiation burns. "Pathetic," he said to the corpse, "to live in such squalor, to let your world rot." He looked up at the sky. It was a bruised purple, choked with clouds that looked like bruises. There were no stars. "Where am I?" He tapped the side of his head, habit forcing him to check a scouter that wasn't there. He was blind. He was stranded, and he was standing in a garbage heap that smelled of copper and death. The crater, the glowing sea, as the local dead things might have called it, eventually gave way to jagged rocky highlands. The prince walked. He had attempted flight moments ago. He had crouched, pushed the energy into his legs, and launched himself skyward, intending to survey the geography from the clouds. But as he ascended, a wave of nausea had buckled his knees. The static in the air, that biting radioactive poison, seemed to thicken with altitude. His energy, usually a smooth river, sputtered like a clogged engine. He had dropped back to the earth, stumbling on the landing. It was a private humiliation, witnessed by no one. Yet it burned him more than any wound. Now he marched. His boots crunched over dried scrub brush and sun-bleached Brahmin skulls. The wind howled through the canyons, kicking up dust that coated his armor in a fine gray film. He hated it. He hated the grit in his teeth. He hated the way the sun felt, hot, but not warming. It felt malignant, like a fever. He reached a ridge and looked down into a valley. There was movement. Not the shambling, empty movement of the rotting things, but something purposeful, heavy. Below, prowling among the wreckage of a rusted caravan, was a beast. It was massive, standing perhaps 10 feet tall, with armored scales the color of dried mud. Massive curved horns swept back from a draconian skull. Its hands were oversized spades of destruction, tipped with claws the length of short swords. A death claw. The prince watched it overturn a rusted truck with a casual shove of one shoulder. It was hunting. "Finally," the prince whispered, "biology that functions." He slid down the embankment, sliding in a controlled avalanche of shale and dust. He landed at the bottom of the valley with a heavy thud, intentionally announcing his presence. The deathclaw froze. Its head snapped towards him. It sniffed the air, confused. The prince didn't smell like fear. He didn't smell like prey. He smelled like ozone and hair gel. The beast roared. The sound was impressive, a guttural thunder that shook the rusted metal skeletons around them. It was a roar meant to liquefy the bowels of lesser men. The prince crossed his arms over his chest. He stood 5'5". The beast was a tower of muscle. "You have spirit," the prince said, his voice bored. "But your stance is amateurish. Too much weight on the toes." The deathclaw didn't understand the critique. It understood only territory. It charged. The ground shook. The beast closed the distance in 3 terrifying strides, kicking up clouds of dirt. It raised a claw, bringing it down in a scythe-like arc that would have cleaved a suit of power armor in half. The prince watched the claw descend. He saw the imperfections in the keratin. He saw the ticks burrowed into the creature's hide. He saw the desperate feral hunger in its yellow eyes. When the claw was an inch from his nose, the prince vanished. Zip. He reappeared standing on the Deathclaw's shoulder. The beast swiped at empty air, stumbling forward. It roared in confusion, thrashing, trying to dislodge the weight on its back. "Too slow," the prince said into the creature's ear. "Is this the apex of this world? A mindless lizard?" He hopped off, flipping backward and landing lightly 10 feet away. The Deathclaw spun around, its eyes red with fury. It opened its maw, ready to bite. The prince raised his right hand. Fingers formed into a knife-hand chop. "Sit down." He moved. It wasn't teleportation. It was simply speed that rendered physics a suggestion. He appeared inside the beast's guard. He drove his hand into the Deathclaw's soft underbelly, just below the rib cage. He didn't use an energy blast. He didn't need to. He pulled his hand back. The Deathclaw gasped, a wet, sucking sound. It looked down. It didn't understand why its legs weren't working. It swayed, then collapsed forward, its massive chin hitting the dirt inches from the prince's boots. The prince looked at his glove. It was coated in a thick, bubbling green slime. The creature's blood. It hissed as it touched the white material of his gloves. Acid, the prince grimaced, shaking his hand violently to fling the muck off. "Even the blood on this planet is dirty." He wiped his hand on the Deathclaw's hide, leaving a white streak on the brown scales. The beast was still breathing, shallow, ragged gasps. It looked up at him, the red fading from its eyes, replaced by the dull gloss of death. The prince stared into the dying creature's eyes. He felt nothing, no thrill of combat, no surge of victory. It was like stepping on a cockroach. "Tell me, beast," the prince said softly to the dying monster. "Is there anything on this rock that can actually fight? Or am I to be the king of ashes?" The Deathclaw exhaled one last time, a rattle of air escaping its lungs, and went still. The prince turned his back on the carcass. The wind picked up again, carrying the sound of distant gunfire. Gunfire, technology. The prince's head snapped up. The sound was faint, rhythmic. Lasers. He looked to the north, past the ridge. Civilization, he murmured, and with it, perhaps, a way off this sphere. He began to walk again, leaving the apex predator of the wasteland rotting in the sun, already forgotten. The smell hit him before the structure came into view. It was a cloying, greasy stench, animal fat rendering over a fire fed by old tires. The smoke was black and oily, curling up into the twilight sky like a stain. The prince crested the cracked asphalt of the highway. Ahead, a relic of the old world jutted out of the overgrown brush. A red rocket ship, paint-peeling and rust-eaten, pointed toward a sky it would never reach again. The station beneath it was a fortress of junk, corrugated metal sheets wired together, sandbags leaking dry earth, and heads on spikes. The heads were decomposed, sun-dried leather stretched over bone. Flies buzzed in lazy clouds. The prince stopped 10 paces from the perimeter. He adjusted his gloves, pulling the white material taut over his knuckles. "Occupants," he barked. His voice carried effortlessly over the wind, sharp and commanding. "I require high-density power couplings and a fusion generator. Bring them to me, and I will allow you to keep your lives." Silence from the station, then laughter. It was a jagged, chem-fueled cackle. A figure emerged from behind a barricade of shopping carts. The man was shirtless, his skin a roadmap of scars and grime, wearing a harness made of leather belts. He held a pipe rifle loosely in one hand, swaying slightly. "Hear that, boys?" the raider shouted, turning back to the garage. "Spaceman wants batteries!" 3 more emerged. They were filth incarnate, rotten teeth, bloodshot eyes, jittery movements. They looked at the prince's armor not with fear, but with the starving greed of vultures spotting fresh meat. "Nice suit," the first raider sneered, leveling the pipe rifle. "Clean, bet it sells for a lot of caps." The prince didn't blink. "I am not a merchant. I am your better. This is your final warning." The raider pulled the trigger. The bullet, a crudely machined slug of lead, struck the prince's chest plate. Ping! It flattened and fell to the asphalt, leaving not even a scratch on the white composite. The prince looked down at the flattened piece of lead, then back up at the raider. "Insulting!" He moved. He covered the 30 feet between them in the time it took the raider to cycle the bolt of his rifle. The prince's hand snapped out, gripping the barrel of the weapon. With a twist of his wrist, he bent the steel barrel back into a U-shape. The raider stared at the ruined gun, his drug-addled brain failing to process the physics. The prince backhanded him. It wasn't a punch meant to kill, it was a slap meant to discipline. But the force snapped the raider's neck with a dry crack, spinning him 360 degrees before he crumpled into the dust. The other 3 raiders screamed, a mix of fury and panic. 2 charged with serrated machetes. The prince sidestepped the first swing with his hands clasped behind his back. He extended a foot, tripping the attacker, then brought his heel down on the man's spine. The crunch was sickeningly audible. The second attacker swung high. The prince ducked, driving a fist into the man's gut. The armor absorbed nothing. The raider folded, vomiting blood instantly as his internal organs ruptured. The fourth raider, standing back near the fuel pumps, didn't charge. He panicked. He fumbled with a weapon that looked different from the others, bulky, wired with exposed coils, humming with a low pitch. He pulled the trigger. A beam of red coherent light lashed out. The prince's eyes widened. He instinctively leaned his head to the left. The laser beam scorched the air where his ear had been, singing the tips of his black hair. It struck the asphalt behind him, melting the stone instantly. The prince froze. He looked at the melted spot on the ground, then at the terrified man holding the weapon. "Energy," the prince whispered. The raider fired again. This time the prince didn't dodge. He raised his hand, catching the beam on his palm. It burned, a sharp, focused heat against his glove, but his ki flared instinctively, a microscopic shield dispersing the energy. He walked forward, walking through the laser fire. The heat rose, but he ignored it. He reached the man, grabbed the weapon by the stock, and ripped it from his hands. With a casual shove, he sent the raider flying into a pile of rusted tin cans. The prince held the weapon up to the dying light. It was crude, square, ugly. A glass-focusing lens was held in place by duct tape. Wires were exposed. It was garbage, but it was directed energy. "You are savages," the prince muttered, running a thumb over the fusion cell jammed into the receiver. "Living in filth, eating rotting meat, yet you have harnessed the photon." He looked at the cowering raider in the trash pile. "Where did you get this?" Night had fallen, bringing a biting cold that seemed to seep up from the irradiated soil itself. Inside the red rocket station, the tire fire had been extinguished. The prince found the smoke intolerable. In its place, the room was lit by a single mesmerizing source. On a rusted metal shelf, amidst empty tin cans and boxes of detergent, sat a bottle. It was shaped like a rocket, filled with a liquid that glowed a brilliant, radioactive blue-violet. Nuka-Cola Quantum. The prince stood before it, his face illuminated by the strontium glow. The color. It was nearly identical to the hue of his Gallic gun. It reminded him of the view from a conqueror's viewport, watching a planet burn in the cold vacuum. He turned away from the bottle. In the center of the room, the surviving raider was tied to a chair with his own leather belts. The man was weeping, snot and blood mixing on his chin. The prince sat on a stack of tires holding the stolen laser rifle. He was disassembling it, stripping the parts with precise mechanical movements. "Stop crying," the prince commanded. "It is pathetic." The raider choked back a sob. "Please, I don't have any caps." "I do not want your currency," the prince said, examining the microfusion cell. It was depleted. He crushed it between his thumb and forefinger, dust trickling to the floor. "This weapon, it is standard issue." It's just a laser rifle," the raider stammered. "Scabbed it off a gunner corpse near Quincy. Please, man, just let me go." "A gunner," the prince repeated. "Soldiers? Mercs. Killers. And who makes these?" The prince held up the focusing crystal. "Who manufactures the energy cells?" The raider shook his head. "Nobody makes them. We find them, or we steal them." The prince sighed, tossing the stripped rifle onto the concrete floor. "Scavengers, all of you, picking the bones of a dead civilization." He stood up, his shadow stretching long against the wall, warped by the blue light of the soda bottle. "I need a manufacturing plant. I need a reactor. I need a power source capable of sublight propulsion. Where are the scientists?" The raider blinked, his eyes widening. "Scientists? You mean, like the Institute? Nobody finds them. They're ghosts. Ghosts do not interest me." The prince stepped closer, looming over the chair. "Who holds the technology? Who has the biggest guns?" The raider swallowed hard. "The Brotherhood," he whispered. "The Brotherhood of Steel." The name hung in the air. The prince tested it on his tongue. Brotherhood of Steel. It sounded militaristic, rigid. "Tell me about them." They came in a ship," the raider blubbered, desperate to be helpful. "A huge airship, the Pridwin. It flies over the airport. They have knights in power armor. They hunt tech. They hoard it. They kill anyone who has it." The prince's eyes narrowed. "An airship?" "Yeah, big as a city. You can see it from the coast. It's got vertibirds. Big robots. They run the whole Commonwealth now." The prince walked to the doorway of the garage. He looked out into the darkness. To the east, miles away, searchlights swept across the cloud cover. He could feel it now, faintly through the static of the radiation. A concentration of power, not biological power, but a hum of reactors, a gathering of artificial strength. "They hoard technology," the prince murmured to himself, "and they fly above the insects." He smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression. "They sound like thieves," he said, "and I hate thieves." He turned back to the raider. The man looked hopeful. I told you what you wanted. You gonna let me go?" The prince looked at the glowing blue bottle on the shelf. He picked it up. The glass was cold. The isotope within swirled. "You have been useful," the prince said, "but you attacked me." "I didn't know," the raider pleaded. "I swear." "Ignorance is not an exemption from consequence." The prince flicked the bottle cap off with his thumb. It hissed. He took a sip. The taste was sickly sweet, chemical, and burned on the way down. Rads spiked in his gut, a flare of discomfort. He grimaced and set the bottle down. "Disgusting," he said. He walked out of the garage into the night air. "Wait, wait!" the raider screamed from the chair. The prince didn't turn around. He simply raised 2 fingers over his shoulder. Flash. A pulse of ki erupted from his fingertips. It wasn't a massive blast, just a concise sphere of energy. It struck the gas pumps outside the station. The explosion was instantaneous. The remaining fuel in the underground tanks ignited. The red rocket station vanished in a roar of orange fire and twisted metal. The shockwave ruffled the prince's cape, blowing his hair forward. He didn't flinch. He didn't look back at the inferno. He fixed his eyes on the distant searchlight sweeping the eastern sky. "Brotherhood of Steel," he said to the darkness. "Let us see if your steel can withstand a Saiyan elite." He began to walk east. The city was a canyon of rot. The prince navigated the labyrinth of downtown Boston with a scowl etched into his features. Here, the static of the radiation was louder, bouncing off the skeletons of skyscrapers that leaned against each other like drunkards. The wind whistled through exposed rebar, creating a mournful atonal flute song. He kept his arms crossed, his cape twitching as he stepped over a crushed civilian vehicle. He was conserving his flight. The sickness, that subtle, clawing nausea in his gut, had not abated. It was a humiliating necessity to walk among the debris like a common infantryman. Thump! The ground vibrated. Thump! The prince stopped. He looked at a puddle of irradiated water near his boot. The ripples were concentric, rhythmic, heavy. "Subtlety is dead on this world," he muttered. From the shadow of a collapsed bank, they emerged. 3 of them. They were hulking monstrosities, larger than the death claw he had dispatched earlier, though lacking the lizard's grace. These were mountains of green muscle, strapped with crude armor made of car tires and wire mesh. Their jaws were distended, teeth jutting out like tusks. Super mutants. "Human!" the leader bellowed. The voice was wet, thick with phlegm. "You have shiny bits! Give!" The mutant wielded a sledgehammer made from a concrete block welded to a pipe. He swung it, testing the weight. The prince sighed, uncrossing his arms. "More failed experiments. Do you primitives possess a single warrior caste worthy of the title?" The leader charged. The speed was surprising for such bulk. A freight train of meat. The concrete hammer whistled through the air, aimed squarely at the prince's skull. The prince didn't dodge. He didn't block. He simply raised his left hand, palm open. Crack. The concrete block slammed into the prince's palm and stopped dead. The impact force dissipated instantly, absorbed by the Saiyan stance. Dust puffed out from the concrete, coating the prince's glove in gray powder. The super mutant blinked, his beady eyes widening in confusion. He grunted, straining, veins bulging on his neck as he tried to push the hammer forward. The prince didn't budge. He stood rooted like an oak tree. "Muscle without technique," the prince critiqued, his voice flat. "You swing like a child throwing a tantrum." He tightened his grip on the concrete block. Under the pressure of his fingers, the stone began to fracture. Crunch. The block exploded into gravel. The mutant stumbled forward off balance. The prince pivoted on his heel. He drove his right fist into the mutant's solar plexus. He didn't use ki. He didn't need the flash of energy. He used pure kinetic torque. The sound was like a wet sandbag hitting pavement from a 10-story drop. The mutant's spine snapped backward. The creature folded, lifting off the ground before crashing into a pile of rubble, motionless. The other 2 mutants roared, not in fear, but in blind, stupid rage. They raised assault rifles, rusty, scavenged things, and opened fire. The prince began to move. He wove through the bullets, his movements a blur of white and blue. He refused to fly. He refused to blast them. He wanted to feel the bones break. He needed to remind his own body of its superiority. He appeared in front of the second mutant. He swept the creature's legs, bringing the giant down to eye level, then delivered a hammer fist to the temple. The skull caved in with a sickening wet crunch. The third mutant dropped his gun and lunged with bare hands. The prince caught the mutant's wrists. He twisted. The sound of snapping radius and ulna bones echoed through the alley. The mutant howled. "Silence, the prince hissed. He kicked the mutant in the chest. The creature flew backward, smashing through the brick wall of a deli, burying itself in the debris. The prince stood alone in the street. He dusted off his shoulder pads. He regulated his breathing, forcing the radioactive air in and out of his lungs. He felt the sweat on his brow, more than there should be for such a trivial exertion. "Pathetic," he whispered, looking at his trembling hand. "I am being reduced to their level." He looked up at the skyline. A massive green wall, painted with a white diamond, rose in the distance. "The settlement," he noted. "Let us see if the humans inside are more intelligent than the cattle outside." The structure was a fortress built of scrap. High walls of green metal plates, reinforced with scaffolding and garbage, surrounded what used to be a stadium. The prince stood before the main gate. It was a heavy, blast-proof door, welded shut and guarded by turrets that tracked his movement with mechanical whirs. A crackle of static erupted from an intercom box mounted on the steel. "Hold it right there, stranger!" a voice buzzed. Tinny, bored and suspicious. "Gates closed. We don't let just anyone into the Great Green Jewel. Who are you?" The prince stared at the metal. "Open it." "Yeah, not how it works, pal," the voice, Danny Sullivan, replied. "You got business? You a traitor? You look like... well, I don't know what you look like. Armor's weird." The prince's patience, already frayed by the sickness and the filth, snapped. He was the prince of all Saiyans. He did not bargain with doormen. "I will not repeat myself," the prince said. The volume of his voice didn't rise, but the intensity did. "Remove this barrier, or I will remove it for you. Look, buddy, take a hike before I have the turrets turn you into Swiss cheese." The prince narrowed his eyes. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't charge a beam. He simply flared his ki. For a microsecond, the air around him distorted, a heat haze of purple aura manifesting and vanishing in the blink of an eye. The pressure wave hit the heavy steel gates. Screech! The sound was agonizing, metal tearing like paper. The massive blast doors didn't explode. They were ripped from their hinges, buckling inward as if struck by a giant invisible battering ram. The steel groaned, twisted, and crashed onto the dirt inside the stadium with a deafening, earth-shaking clang. Dust billowed up, a thick cloud of rust and concrete. The prince walked through the dust. He didn't cough. He stepped over the twisted wreckage of the door he had just dismantled with a glare. He emerged into the market. Diamond City froze. The bustle of the trade hub died instantly. A Brahmin ceased its chewing. A Protectron noodle vendor paused mid-stir. Dozens of eyes, settlers in rags, guards in baseball gear, wealthy residents in clean suits, locked onto the short, muscular figure in the pristine white armor. The silence was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. The prince stopped in the center of the entrance ramp. He scanned the crowd. He saw fear. He saw confusion. He saw weakness. To his left, a woman in a red leather trench coat, Piper, stood with her mouth slightly open, a notebook forgotten in her hand. A guard, Danny Sullivan, picked himself up from where the shockwave had knocked him down, staring at the destroyed gate in horror. The prince ignored them all. He looked toward the center of the town where the elite lived on the upper decks. "Which one of you is the leader?" His voice cut through the silence, clear and imperious. No one answered. The prince took a step forward. The sound of his boot hitting the metal floor plate echoed like a gunshot. "I require information regarding the airship docked at the airport," he stated, addressing the terrified crowd as if they were his subjects. "And I require food that is not irradiated. Bring me the one in charge." A tin can, knocked over by a trembling child near the surplus store, rolled across the corrugated metal ground. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was deafening in the quiet. The prince's eyes darted to the can, then back to the crowd. He sneered. Well, he demanded, do not make me ask a third time. My patience is as limited as your architecture. From the upper ramp, a heavy-set man in a suit, Mayor McDonough, appeared, sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Now, the mayor stammered, his voice cracking. There's no need for violence. I am the mayor. Welcome to Diamond City. Please, just don't break anything else. The prince looked up at the fat man. He saw the deception in the man's eyes, the fear masking something else. But he didn't care. Get down here, the prince ordered. We have business. The neon sign buzzed with a dying, erratic flicker. Valentine's Detective Agency. The red heart logo was cracked, leaking pink light onto the dusty alley floor. The prince pushed the door open. He didn't knock. The bell above the frame jingled, a cheerful, tinny sound that clashed violently with the heavy, brooding atmosphere of the room. It smelled of stale tobacco, old paper, and machine oil. Inside, a woman in a wool sweater gasped, dropping a file folder. She scrambled backward, knocking over a cup of pencils. Who are you? You can't just barge in here! The prince ignored her. His eyes locked onto the figure sitting behind the desk. The man wore a battered trench coat and a fedora pulled low. He was lighting a cigarette, the flame of the lighter illuminating a face that was a roadmap of damage. But it wasn't scarred flesh. It was torn, synthetic rubber. Beneath the gray skin, metal gears turned, and yellow eyes glowed with an artificial luminescence. A machine. The prince stopped. The hostility in his posture shifted, replaced by a cold, analytical curiosity. An android, the prince stated. He stepped closer, his boots thudding on the wooden floorboards. I did not think this mudball capable of such robotics. The detective took a long drag of the cigarette. Smoke curled out of his mouth and from a tear in his cheek. He exhaled slowly, the yellow eyes narrowing. Android? Synth? Metalhead? I've been called a lot of things, the detective said. His voice was gravelly, filtered through a synthesizer that had seen better days. But usually folks knock before they start with the name-calling. What can Nick Valentine do for you, stranger? Assuming you're not here to scrap me for parts. The prince stopped at the edge of the desk. He looked down at the exposed servos in Nick's neck. I have no need for your scrap, the prince said. I require calculation. Trajectory analysis. Nick leaned back, the old chair creaking. He ashed his cigarette in a ceramic tray. Trajectory? You looking for a lost Brahmin, or are you trying to shoot the moon? The airship, the prince said. The one hovering over the eastern ruins. I need to know its defensive perimeter, its patrol intervals, and the most direct vector to its command deck that avoids their primary heavy artillery. Nick paused. The mechanical whirring of his internal focusing lens was audible in the quiet room. Zzzt, zzzt. He looked the prince up and down, taking in the white armor, the gloves, the sheer palpable arrogance radiating off him. The Pridwin, Nick murmured. You planning a suicide run, pal? The Brotherhood of Steel doesn't exactly roll out the red carpet for tourists, especially not ones looking to breach the bridge. I do not care about their carpet. I care about their fusion cores. The prince leaned forward, placing his gloved hands on the desk. You are a machine. You process data. Do not feign human hesitation. It is inefficient. Nick chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Straight to the point. I like that. But information isn't free in Diamond City. The prince's expression darkened. My payment is that I do not reduce this shack to splinters. Ellie, the secretary, made a squeaking sound of terror from the corner. Nick didn't flinch. He held the prince's gaze. Tough guy. All right, I can see you're not the type to haggle. Nick reached under the desk and pulled out a holotape. He slotted it into a terminal. The screen flickered to life, green text scrolling rapidly. "The Brotherhood runs vertibird patrols on a 15-minute loop," Nick said, his voice shifting into a monotone recitation as he read the data. "They have a blind spot on the ventral hull, near the intake valves, but their radar sweep is constant. If you're flying—" "Wait, do you have a vertibird?" "I fly," the prince corrected. Nick paused. He looked up, the yellow eyes blinking. "Right, you fly. Sure. If you fly, you'll want to approach from the sun. Their optical sensors have a glare deficiency at high noon, but the radiation shielding on that ship is thick. If you're planning to punch through, you'd better bring a nuke." "I am the nuke," the prince muttered. He memorized the data scrolling on the screen, the coordinates, the patrol paths, the structural weak points. His mind absorbed the tactical layout with the ease of a veteran commander. "Satisfactory," the prince said, straightening up. "Just one thing," Nick said, crushing the cigarette out. "Why? Why take on the biggest army in the Commonwealth alone?" The prince turned to the door. He paused, looking back at the synth. "Because they have what is mine," the prince said, "and because lions do not concern themselves with the opinions of sheep or toasters." He walked out. The bell jingled again, a cheerful farewell. Nick sat in the silence, listening to the fading footsteps. "Ellie?" Nick said softly. Yeah, boss." "Lock the door and pour me a drink." That guy, his readings were off the charts. I've never seen a Geiger counter do that before. The plains of the Commonwealth were a flat, gray expanse of misery. The prince walked. He had abandoned flight hours ago. It wasn't just the energy conservation anymore. It was the weight. Every step felt like he was walking through knee-deep water. His armor, usually a second skin he barely noticed, felt like lead plates strapped to his chest. Sweat, cold and oily, trickled down his spine, pooling at the small of his back. He stopped, bracing a hand against the husk of a withered tree. He coughed. It started as a tickle in his throat, then erupted into a hacking, violent spasm that bent him double. His chest heaved. When the fit subsided, he pulled his hand away from his mouth. The white glove was speckled with red. "Impossible," he rasped, staring at the blood. The droplets sat on the hydrophobic material, refusing to soak in. "I am immune to sickness." He looked at the horizon. The air shimmered with heat and that damned green haze. The radiation. It wasn't attacking his immune system. It was clogging his ki. His energy channels, the pathways that allowed him to channel the power of a star, were silting up with heavy isotopes. He was suffocating on the metaphysical level. "Just a little further," he hissed, forcing his legs to straighten. "The ship, the cure." He took a step. Tremor. The ground beneath him shifted. The prince froze. His senses, usually a radar sphere extending for miles, were dull, filled with the static noise of the wasteland. He couldn't isolate the vibration. Was it a tremor, an earthquake? Crunch. The earth exploded behind him. He spun around, but his reaction time was sluggish, a fraction of a second too slow. A pincer, hard as chitinous rock and serrated like a saw, clamped around his left ankle. "What?" He was yanked downward. The ground swallowed him to the knee. From the dust cloud, a tail emerged. It was bulbous, glistening with venom, tipped with a needle the size of a spear. A rad scorpion, an albino hunter, its shell pale and thick. It struck. The stinger drove toward his chest. The prince caught it. His hands, shaking with fever, clamped around the thick tail just inches from his breastplate. The force of the impact drove him deeper into the dirt. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched chittering sound that grated on his nerves. "Get off!" He squeezed. He tried to summon his strength, to crush the carapace like he had the rock in the city. But his grip was weak. The sickness had sapped his hydraulic pressure. The scorpion thrashed, its legs scrabbling for purchase, pushing the stinger closer. A drop of venom leaked from the tip. It sizzled on his armor. Another tremor. To his right, another one erupted, then a third. An ambush. The second scorpion lunged for his exposed head. "Enough!" the prince roared. He forced his ki to flare, ignoring the burning pain it caused in his meridians. A shockwave of white aura exploded from his body, blowing the dirt and the creature's back. The scorpion holding his leg was torn loose, its pincer shattering. It tumbled backward, screeching. The prince scrambled out of the hole, hovering a few feet off the ground. He was panting, his vision swam, the edges blurring into gray vignettes. "You dare!" he screamed, his voice raw. "I am the prince of all Saiyans! I am not food for bugs!" The albino scorpion recovered. It charged, scuttling over the rocks with terrifying speed. The prince held out his right hand. His fingertips were numb. He couldn't feel the air. He couldn't feel the energy gathering. He had to rely on sight alone. Big bang. He hesitated. A full attack would drain him. He might pass out. He changed tactics. He dropped to the ground, relying on martial arts. The scorpion struck. The prince sidestepped, his movement sluggish but still faster than the arachnid. He delivered a roundhouse kick to the creature's head. Crack. The shell held. The prince's eyes widened. What? His physical strength had plummeted. The kick should have decapitated it. Instead, it only stunned the beast. The scorpion whipped its tail around. The side of the stinger slammed into the prince's ribs. He flew. He hit a boulder, shattering it on impact, and rolled into the dust. Pain flared in his side, sharp, hot, and real. He lay there for a second, staring at the gray sky. He was losing to a bug. Rage. It wasn't the clean, burning pride of a warrior. It was the desperate, ugly anger of a survivor. He pushed himself up. His eyes turned teal. Die. He pointed 2 fingers. Zip. A pencil-thin beam of energy pierced the albino scorpion's eye, exiting the back of its skull. It collapsed instantly. The other 2 scorpions halted. They sensed the shift, the sudden spike in dangerous energy. The prince stood up, clutching his side. He didn't fire again. He simply looked at them. His aura flickered around him, unstable, jagged like a failing electrical connection. "Come," he whispered. The scorpions chittered, tapped their legs nervously, and then burrowed back into the earth. They fled. The prince dropped to one knee. He coughed again, more blood splattering the dust. The metallic stinging in his lungs was now afire. He looked at his fingertips. They were trembling uncontrollably. He looked east. The silhouette of the airship was visible now, a dark whale swimming in the clouds. "Technology," he gasped, forcing himself to stand. "Healing." He stumbled forward, one foot in front of the other, a god dragging his own mortality through the dirt. The shadow of the airship fell over him like a tombstone. The prince stood amidst the shattered tarmac of the Boston airport, the wind whipping his cape into a frenzy. Above, the Pridwin groaned. It was a massive, ugly thing, a bloated tick of steel and hydrogen, tethered to the sky by the sheer brute force of its thrusters. The sound was physical, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in the prince's teeth. He clenched his fists. The movement sent a spike of pain up his forearms, the radiation sickness acting like ground glass in his joints. He ignored it. He bent his knees, the ground cracking beneath his boots. "Up," he commanded his own failing body. He launched. The ascent was not the effortless streak of light he was used to. It was a struggle against gravity. The air felt thick, oily. He pushed through it, a white comet rising toward the steel belly of the beast. Whoosh, thud, thud, thud. A shape detached from the airship's flank. A vertibird. It swung around, its rotors chopping the air with violent precision. A searchlight blinded him. "Unidentified flying object," a voice crackled over a loudspeaker distorted by the wind. "Disengage immediately or be fired upon!" The prince didn't slow down. He flew straight at the light. The vertibird's nose-mounted minigun spun up. Brrrt! A stream of high-velocity lead slammed into the prince. Sparks danced off his chest plate. The impact force was negligible, like rain hitting a windshield, but the sheer volume was annoying. It obscured his vision. "Insects!" the prince roared. He breached the distance in a heartbeat. He didn't fire an energy blast. He couldn't spare the key. Instead, he collided with the aircraft. He grabbed the port side wing pylon with both hands. The metal was hot, vibrating violently. Inside the cockpit, the pilot screamed, his helmet reflecting the prince's snarling face through the glass. "Get down!" The prince twisted his torso. With a screech of tearing aluminum that drowned out the engines, he ripped the entire wing off the fuselage. The vertibird lurched, spinning uncontrollably into a flat spin. It plummeted toward the airport ruins below. The prince didn't watch it fall. He tossed the severed wing aside like a chicken bone and continued his ascent. He crested the lip of the flight deck. 2 knights in T-60 power armor stood guard, their laser rifles raised. They looked like walking tanks, clunky and slow. The prince landed on the steel grating. Clang! The vibration traveled through the deck. The knights hesitated, their sensors likely trying to process the readings of the small man in white armor who had just swatted a gunship out of the sky. "Target acquired!" the left knight shouted, his voice modulated and deep. "Stand aside!" the prince wheezed. He straightened up, fighting the urge to vomit blood. He wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. "I am here for the king." They fired. Red laser beams struck his shoulders. The heat was sharp, hotter than the raider's toy gun, singeing the fabric of his bodysuit beneath the armor. The prince gritted his teeth. He stepped forward. He moved inside the guard of the first knight, grabbed the barrel of the laser rifle, and drove his knee into the knight's chest piece. The steel breastplate caved in. The knight wheezed, the air driven from his lungs, and collapsed backward with the screech of servos failing. The prince looked at the second knight. His eyes were burning with a feverish intensity. "Do you also wish to be scrap metal?" The knight lowered his weapon, stepping back, the fear palpable even through the layers of steel. The prince walked past him, toward the heavy blast doors leading to the command deck. The exhaust from the ship's main thrusters blew hot against his face, smelling of kerosene and ozone. The command deck smelled of recycled air, stale coffee, and high-voltage electronics. The heavy bulkhead door didn't slide open. It burst inward, the locking mechanism shearing off with a deafening pop, the steel plate crashing onto the great floor. Heads turned. Scribes dropped their clipboards. Lancers froze at their terminals. At the center of the room, standing before a massive glass viewport that overlooked the Wasteland, stood Elder Maxon. He turned slowly, the leather of his battle coat creaking. His face was scarred, his beard groomed, his eyes hard and fanatical. The prince stepped over the ruined door. He looked small in the cavernous room, surrounded by men in armor and machinery, but his presence filled the space, a heavy, suffocating gravity. "You," Maxon said, his voice calm, dangerous. "The anomaly, the one who destroyed the glowing sea crater." "I am the Prince of all Saiyans," the prince announced. His voice was raspy, but it held the imperious cadence of royalty. "And you are sitting in my chair." Captain Kells, standing to Maxon's right, drew a laser pistol. "Identify yourself properly, mutant." How did you board this vessel?" "I flew," the prince said. He walked closer, ignoring the dozen laser rifles now pointed at his head. "I require your fusion cores, all of them, and your repair facilities." Maxon stepped forward. He didn't look afraid, he looked disgusted. "You speak of technology as if you have a right to it," Maxon spat. "We have tracked your energy signature since you fell from the sky. It is unclean, volatile. You are a weapon, a biological abomination." "I am a god compared to you," the prince retorted, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The sickness was pulsing in his head, a migraine that blinded him to the finer details of the room. "Now, give me the cores, or I will turn this balloon into a funeral pyre." Maxon narrowed his eyes. "Fire!" The command deck erupted in light. Every soldier in the room pulled the trigger. Dozens of red beams converged on the prince. The air sizzled. The smell of ozone became overpowering, tasting like copper on the tongue. The heat was intense. The prince crossed his arms over his face, gritting his teeth. The lasers burned. They weren't lethal, not yet, but the cumulative heat was blistering his skin. His armor was scorching, turning black in spots. "Enough!" He flung his arms outward. A shockwave of ki, white and jagged, blasted outward. It shattered the tactical table in the center of the room. It blew the scribes off their feet, sending papers fluttering like snow. The glass of the main viewport cracked, a spiderweb fracture spreading across the view of the horizon. The firing stopped. Smoke curled from the prince's armor. He stood panting, his chest heaving. A trickle of blood ran from his nose. "Your toys hurt," he admitted, his voice low, "but they do not kill." He took a step toward Maxon. Maxon hadn't fallen. He stood his ground, gripping the railing of the command platform. He looked at the blood on the prince's face. He saw the tremor in the alien's hands. "You're dying," Maxon realized. A cruel smile touched his lips. "The radiation, it's eating you alive. You're not a god. You're just another sick mutant." The prince snarled, his eyes flashing teal. He raised a hand, palm facing Maxon. Energy began to gather, a purple sphere crackling with destructive potential. "I have enough life left to erase you." Maxon didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy, industrial-looking remote detonator. He flipped the safety cover. "You want to fight, monster?" Maxon yelled over the alarm klaxons that had started to blare. "The Brotherhood does not surrender. We cleanse!" Maxon slammed his thumb down on the red button. "Liberty Prime! Activate! Target designation, the intruder!" Whoop, whoop, whoop! A new sound echoed from below, from the airport ruins beneath the ship. It was a mechanical groan, deep and terrifying, like the Earth itself waking up. "Commencing tactical assessment," a voice boomed from the ground, loud enough to be heard through the hull of the airship. "Red Chinese threat detected." The floor of the command deck shook. The prince paused, the energy fading from his hand. He looked down through the cracked glass floor. Below, amidst the wreckage of the airport, the ground was breaking apart. A metal hand, the size of a tank, punched up through the concrete. A head followed, a massive iron skull with a glowing blue visor. A giant robot. The prince's eyes widened. A grin, unbidden and manic, stretched across his face. "A doll," the prince whispered. "A giant metal doll." He looked back at Maxon. "Finally," the prince laughed, the sound wet with blood. "Something worth breaking." He turned and ran toward the shattered viewport. He didn't stop. He smashed through the glass, diving out of the airship, plummeting toward the giant rising from the earth below. The wind roared in his ears, a chaotic rushing sound that stripped the airship's alarms away. The prince fell. He didn't fly. He let gravity claim him, a white bullet dropping from the heavens. Below, the earth was breaking apart. Concrete slabs the size of houses were being shoved aside like wet cardboard. The machine rose. It was a titan of pre-war arrogance. 40 feet of steel plating, hydraulic pistons, and patriotic programming. Its eyes glowed a piercing, hateful blue. "Democracy is non-negotiable," the robot boomed. The voice didn't come from a throat. It came from massive external speakers that shook the dust off the surrounding ruins. The prince smiled. The wind whipped his hair back, exposing the manic gleam in his eyes. He slammed into the ground. Boom! He didn't land softly. He landed like a meteor, creating a crater 10 feet deep in the cracked tarmac of the airport runway. Dust billowed up, obscuring him for a heartbeat. Liberty Prime paused in its advance. The giant metal head swiveled down, servos whining with the pitch of a jet engine. "Obstruction detected," the robot announced. "Probability of mission hindrance 0%. From the dust, the prince walked out. He rolled his neck, a sickening crack echoing in the momentary silence. He looked up at the towering monstrosity. "You are big," the prince shouted, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum. "But size is a crutch for the weak." Liberty Prime responded by activating its ocular lasers. 2 beams of concentrated blue light, thick as tree trunks, slashed down. They vaporized the air, turning the moisture into instant steam. The prince vanished. The lasers struck the crater, melting the rock into slag in a fraction of a second. The prince reappeared in the air, level with the robot's chest. He crossed his arms. "Slow!" He kicked. He drove his boot into the robot's chest plating. The impact rang out like a bell being struck by a freight train. Gong! The 40-foot giant stumbled. Metal buckled. The U.S. Army star painted on its chest crumpled inward. Liberty Prime took a thunderous step back to steady itself, crushing a rusted bus flat under its heel. "Tactical assessment. Red Chinese super soldier detected," the robot blared. "Engaging with lethal force." The robot reached behind its back. A massive mechanical claw retrieved a projectile from a dispenser pack. It was shaped like a football, but the size of a man. A mini-nuke. The prince hovered, watching with genuine curiosity. A ball. Liberty Prime wound up, a terrifying display of hydraulic torque. And through. The nuke spiraled through the air, whistling. It was clumsy, primitive. A child throwing a rock. The prince didn't dodge. He extended one hand. He caught the nose of the nuke. Thud. His flight path dipped an inch from the momentum, but he held it. He looked at the device in his palm. It was warm. He could hear the internal mechanism ticking. "This is your weapon?" The prince sneered at the robot. "A bomb? How crude." He squeezed. He intended to crush the casing, to render it inert, but he miscalculated the volatility of the isotope within. The casing cracked. Flash. The world turned white. It wasn't the clean, spiritual light of Kai. It was dirty, blinding, and hot. The nuke detonated in his hand. The explosion engulfed him. A sphere of fire and radiation expanded, swallowing the prince and washing over the chest of Liberty Prime. The shockwave shattered the windows of the distant airport terminal and knocked the circling Brotherhood vertibirds out of formation. The fireball roared, consuming the oxygen, creating a vacuum that pulled the debris back into the center. Liberty Prime stood firm, its armor scorched but intact. "Target neutralized! America prevails!" But as the smoke swirled, a silhouette remained. Floating in the center of the black cloud, the prince was still there. His armor was blackened. His cape was tattered. the ends burning with small orange flames. His glove had been incinerated, revealing a hand that was red, blistered, and smoking. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't smiling anymore. The heat didn't fade. It lingered, a heavy blanket of invisible needles pricking at his skin. The prince looked at his hand. The skin was raw, weeping clear fluid, but the pain in his flesh was distant, secondary. The real pain was inside. The nuke hadn't just burned him with fire, it had bathed him in a concentrated dose of radiation. He felt his key channels constrict violently, as if someone had poured liquid concrete into his veins. His heart hammered, thump, 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 an erratic, panicked rhythm. The world tilted on its axis, the gray sky smeared into the green ground. He gagged. A mouthful of blood, thick and dark, spilled over his lip. It splattered onto his charred chest plate. No, he wheezed. The word was a bubble of blood. The radiation, it was accelerating. The sickness wasn't a slow decay anymore, it was a cascading failure. His biology, so superior in combat, was drinking the poison of this world faster than a human ever could. "Communist threat remains active," Liberty Prime boomed. The robot took a step forward. The ground shook, but to the prince it felt like the entire planet was spinning. "Weapons free!" The robot raised its arm. A laser Gatling gun mounted on the limb spun up. The prince tried to raise his guard. His arms felt like lead. His vision tunneled. He saw 3 robots, then 1, then a blur of blue light. "This is it," a voice in his head whispered. "The great Vegeta, killed by a toy on a garbage planet." The thought cut through the fog. It was sharper than the pain. Indignation. It rose from his gut, burning hotter than the radiation. To die here? To die to this? The Gatling laser fired. Pew, pew, pew. Red bolts hammered him. He dropped out of the sky, crashing onto one knee in the rubble. The lasers chewed up the ground around him, splashing molten rock onto his boots. He knelt there, panting, blood dripping from his nose and mouth. The robot marched closer, its shadow eclipsing him. "Democracy is truth. Communism is death." The prince looked up. His eyes, usually black, flashed with a teal luminescence. The veins in his forehead bulged, dark and distended against his pale skin. "Shut up!" He forced himself to stand. His legs trembled violently. He ignored the screaming of his cells. He reached deep, past the sickness, past the clogged meridians, finding the core of his power that still burned. He pulled his hands back to his left hip. The motion was sluggish, painful, but the muscle memory was absolute. Gallic. Purple light began to gather between his cupped hands. It wasn't the smooth hum of energy he was used to. It was jagged, loud. It sounded like tearing fabric. The electricity arcing around him was violet, clashing violently with the gray smoke of the battlefield. Liberty Prime stopped. The robot's sensors detected the spike. "Warning, energy surge detected. Defense protocols engaged." The robot diverted all power to its eye lasers. It prepared to fire a killing blow. The prince screamed. It was a guttural, wet sound, forcing the blood out of his throat to make room for the power. "A gun!" He thrust his hands forward. The beam that erupted was massive, a concentrated torrent of electric purple light, spiraling with raw, unrefined power. It screamed across the gap, the sound of ionization tearing the atmosphere apart. Liberty Prime fired its eye lasers. The blue beams met the purple wave. There was no contest. The Gallic gun swallowed the lasers. It hit the robot's chest. For a millisecond, the metal held. Then it simply ceased to exist. The beam bored through the 40-foot titan, coring it like an apple. The purple light exited the robot's back, continuing on to carve a trench through the airport terminal, through the tarmac, and out into the ocean beyond. Liberty Prime stood there for a second, a gaping, molten hole where its reactor used to be. "System. Failure." The voice died down into a garbled, robotic groan. The giant machine tipped forward. Crash. It hit the earth with the weight of a falling skyscraper. Metal sheared, parts flew. A cloud of dust and steam rose up, silent and final. The purple beam faded. The prince stood in the silence. His hands were still outstretched, smoking. The purple aura around him flickered and died. He fell forward. He caught himself on his hands and knees. He vomited. Blood, bile, and something that looked like black tar. He looked at the wreckage of the machine. He had won. But as he tried to stand, his legs refused. He collapsed onto his side, his cheek pressing against the warm radioactive dirt. The victory tasted of iron. "Damn. You," he whispered to the dead world. His eyes rolled back, and the darkness took him. The silence was heavier than the robot had been. The airport ruins were a graveyard of twisted rebar and smoldering fires. The trench carved by the prince's energy attack hissed as the ocean water began to seep into the molten rock at the far end. The prince lay on his side. The ground was warm, radiating the heat of the blast he had just survived. He stared at a piece of gravel inches from his nose. It vibrated slightly. Boots. Heavy, rhythmic, metal-clad boots. The prince forced a breath into his lungs. It rattled, wet and thick. He pushed his palms against the dirt. His arms shook, not with fear, but with a muscular failure so profound it felt like paralysis. He locked his elbows, levering his torso up. He would not be found on the ground. "Hold fire," a voice commanded. "Elder Maxon." The prince turned his head. The movement made the world swim in a nauseating blur of gray and green. A circle of steel had formed around him. Knights in T-60 power armor, their laser rifles lowered but ready. Paladins with heavy breathing audible through their external speakers. Maxon stood at the front, his battle coat dusted with ash, his face pale as he looked from the smoking crater of Liberty Prime back to the small, broken man in the center. "The machine!" the prince rasped. He spat a clot of dark blood onto the tarmac. "Is broken." Maxon took a step forward. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked terrified. The fanaticism in his eyes had been replaced by the cold, hard math of survival. They had just watched a man dismantle their god with his bare hands. "You destroyed Prime," Maxon said, his voice quiet, "with light." "I am." The prince tried to stand. His knees buckled, but he caught himself. He stood swaying, a king made of glass. "I am the superior weapon. You hoard technology. Now, you belong to me." He looked at the circle of knights. "Kneel." It was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a guillotine. A knight to the left hesitated, then dropped to one knee. The servos whined, then another. The fear was contagious. They weren't looking at a mutant. They were looking at an extinction event. Maxon looked at his soldiers, then back at the prince. He saw the trembling hands, the blood, the sweat. But he also saw the trench cut through the earth. Maxon slowly lowered his laser rifle. "We surrender," Maxon said, the words tasting of bile. "The Brotherhood yields." The prince grinned. It was a rictus of bloody teeth. "Good," he whispered. "Now, bring me the cause." The victory rushed through him, a surge of adrenaline. But as the adrenaline faded, the sickness rushed back in to fill the void. The radiation poisoning, accelerated by the nuke and the exertion, slammed into his nervous system. The world went white. His legs vanished beneath him. He didn't feel the impact when he hit the ground this time. He just felt the cold creeping in from his extremities. "He's down!" a scribe shouted. "Secure him!" Maxon ordered, the fear instantly replaced by opportunistic aggression. "Get the restraints. If he bleeds, we can kill him." The knights surged forward, the heavy thudding of their boots vibrating against the prince's cheek. "No," the prince thought, unable to move his lips. "I am the prince." Then a new sound cut through the chaos. Crack fizz. It was the sound of air being displaced violently. Static electricity spiked, raising the hair on the prince's neck. The smell of ozone returned, but it wasn't the dirty smell of lasers. It was clean, sharp. Blue lightning arced around the prince's prone body. "Contact!" Maxon yelled, backing away. "Institute relay! Open fire!" The command was cut short. The blue light intensified, blinding and cold. The prince felt a sensation of weightlessness, a tearing feeling in his gut as if his atoms were being pulled through a straw. The Brotherhood, the airport, the ruin. It all dissolved into a tunnel of blue static. Maxon's shout faded into silence. The prince was gone. Waking up was usually a physical process, a return to the body. This was different. This was a return to sensory deprivation. The prince opened his eyes. White, blinding, sterile, absolute white. He blinked, his pupils constricting painfully. He wasn't on the dirt anymore. He wasn't feeling the wind or smelling the rot of the wasteland. He smelled lemons and antiseptic, the sharp chemical tang of a hospital that was too clean to be for healing. He tried to sit up. His forehead struck something hard and invisible. A shock, mild but firm, zapped his skin. He recoiled, his hand flying to his head. He looked up. He was inside a glass cube. No, not glass. Energy. A containment field, translucent and shimmering with a faint blue hue. He was sitting on a sleek white bench in the center of a room that looked like the inside of a microchip. The walls were smooth panels of white polymer. The lighting came from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows. "Indignity," he hissed. He stood up, ignoring the stiffness in his joints. The sickness was still there, a dull ache in his bones. But the acute nausea had subsided slightly. The air here was scrubbed, filtered. He pressed his gloved hand against the barrier. The energy field rippled like water, pushing back against his touch with a low-frequency vibration. "A cage?" The prince looked around the empty room. "You put me in a cage?" A door slid open. It made no sound, simply retracting into the wall. Two figures entered. They were not soldiers in rusted armor. They were not mutants in tire rubber. They wore pristine white coats, clean trousers, and held clipboards. Their faces were soft, unweathered by the sun. Scientists. Behind them stood a figure in a black leather trench coat, sunglasses, stoic, a courser. The prince sensed the energy coming from the man in black. It was flat, artificial, just like the detective, but denser, dangerous. One of the scientists, a man with balding gray hair and thick glasses, tapped on his clipboard. He looked at the prince with the detached curiosity of a child looking at a beetle in a jar. "Remarkable," the scientist muttered. "Subject has regained consciousness. Vital signs are stabilizing despite the lethal dosage of rads in his bloodstream. His cellular regeneration is aggressive." "Can he hear us?" the second scientist, a younger woman, asked. She looked nervous. "The field is sound permeable, yes," the man replied. He stepped closer to the barrier. "Can you understand me, subject? I am Dr. Io. You are in the Institute." The prince stared at him, the sheer audacity of the question. "Open this," the prince said. His voice was calm, which made it more terrifying than a scream. "And I will grant you a quick death." Dr. Ao chuckled dryly. He didn't look threatened. He looked at his data. Hostility levels commensurate with a super mutant, but the intelligence is clearly higher. Tell me, are you a pre-war experiment? A ghoul mutation? Your physiology is alien." "I am not a mutation," the prince spat. He placed both hands on the field. He pushed. "I am Vegeta, and you are a worm in a lab coat." He flared his ki. Just a fraction. A burst to shatter the glass. Zzz-zit. The containment field didn't break. It absorbed the energy. The lights in the room flickered, and a high-pitched alarm chirped on the scientist's console. But the wall held. The prince gasped, pulling his hands back. They were smoking. The field had fed back his own energy into his nerves. "Fascinating," Dr. Ao noted, scribbling furiously. "He projects energy, kinetic displacement. No! Thermal! We need to calibrate the suppression dampers." The prince fell back onto the bench. He was weaker than he thought. The field was designed to drain power. They had analyzed him. "You possess technology," the prince said, his breathing heavy. "Teleportation! Energy shields!" "We are the future," Dr. Ao said, puffing up his chest slightly. "We are the only hope for humanity, and you are a very interesting battery." The courser in the back spoke up. His voice was monotone. "Sir, Father has requested an audience once the subject is processed." Yes, Ao waved his hand. "Let him simmer. We need to extract a blood sample. I want to see what makes this thing tick." "Thing," the prince whispered. He looked down at his boots. The white leather was stained with the mud of the surface. He was trapped in a white box buried underground, being studied by weaklings who thought they were gods because they had light bulbs and clean water. It was the ultimate insult. And for the first time since landing, the prince felt something other than rage. He felt clarity. These weren't savages. These were the jailers. And jailers had keys. "You want my blood?" The prince looked up, a dark predator's smile touching his lips. "Come and take it." Dr. Ao hesitated. He looked at the courser. "Prep the sedation gas. I don't want him awake for the extraction." The scientist tapped a panel on the wall. A vent hissed open near the floor. A pale yellow gas began to fill the containment cell. The prince didn't hold his breath. He sat perfectly still, watching them through the shimmering haze. He memorized their faces. He memorized the panel sequence. "Let them think I am sleeping," he thought as the gas clouded his vision. "Let them bring me into their heart." He closed his eyes, feigning unconsciousness, and waited for the door to open. The yellow sedation gas had dissipated hours ago. The prince sat on the white bench, his legs crossed, eyes closed. He was meditating, visualizing the poison in his blood as a physical enemy, wrestling it into a corner of his biology. "Respiration normal, heart rate still elevated but rhythmic." Dr. Ao's voice drifted through the containment field. "He metabolizes toxins at an impossible rate. The gas merely annoyed him." "We should terminate," a colder voice suggested. "A courser. He is too volatile." "Nonsense," Ao scoffed. "Open the aperture. I want a tissue sample. X6. Keep your weapon trained on his parietal lobe." The prince's eyes snapped open. They were not groggy. They were sharp, black obsidian. Buzz. A small section of the energy field dissolved, creating a window just large enough for a syringe-wielding robotic arm to pass through. The prince didn't move. He watched the needle extend. He waited until the metal tip was an inch from his exposed bicep. Then he moved. He didn't pull away. He lunged through the gap. His hand shot out of the containment field, grabbing the robotic arm. With a wet crunch of gears, he yanked it. The entire mechanism was ripped from the ceiling mount, dragging wires and sparking electronics with it. "Containment breach!" Ao shrieked, stumbling back. The prince didn't let go. He used the hole in the field as an anchor. He planted his boots on the floor and screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a kiai, a martial shout to focus power. Hurrah! His aura flared, not a flicker this time, but a solid eruption of white flame. The containment field designed to dampen energy whined in protest. The air inside the cube rippled. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. The energy emitters in the corners of the room overloaded. The blue walls flickered and died. The prince stood free. The white lab coat of Dr. Io was the only thing shaking in the sudden silence. "Fascinating," the prince whispered, dropping the severed robot arm. "Your cages are made of glass." X-688, the courser, fired. The laser beam was accurate, aimed directly at the prince's eye. The prince tilted his head. The beam scorched his cheek, leaving a thin red line. "Reflexes superior," X-688 stated, drawing a serrated combat knife. The synth moved with a blur of speed that would have terrified a human. To the prince, it was underwater ballet. He stepped inside the courser's guard. He caught the synth's wrist. He squeezed. The synthetic radius snapped with the sound of dry wood breaking. X-688 didn't scream. It just adjusted its grip with the other hand. "Plastic," the prince sneered. He drove his palm into the courser's chest. The impact crumpled the synth's ribcage, sending the machine flying backward. It smashed through the glass partition of the observation deck, tumbling into the hallway beyond. Dr. Ao was hyperventilating, backing into a corner. You can't be. The readings?" The prince ignored him. He walked out of the cell, his boots squeaking on the pristine, polished floor. He emerged into the bioscience lab. It was a lush, indoor jungle. Artificial sunlight streamed from above. Genetically modified ferns and trees grew in neat rows. It smelled of fertilizer and false hope. And there, in massive cylindrical tanks of green fluid, floated the truth. Super mutants. They were suspended in stasis, tubes running into their distended muscles. The prince stopped. He looked at the hulking abominations, then at the clean, white scientists scurrying away in terror. "You made them," the prince said softly. "The monsters on the surface, they are not natural. They are your children." We seek to improve humanity," a voice called out. The prince turned. An old man stood at the top of the central spiral staircase. He leaned on a cane. He wore a clean white coat, but his eyes were weary, unafraid. "I am Father," the old man said, descending the stairs slowly, "and you are destroying my facility." The prince looked at the frail human. "You are the leader? You are the one who hides underground while the world rots?" "We are preserving the future," Father replied, his voice calm. "The surface is dead. We are the definition of mankind redefined. You have power, stranger. I can see that. Join us. With your biology, we could perfect the human race." The prince laughed. It was a cold barking sound that echoed off the glass tanks. "Perfect?" The prince gestured to the floating super mutant. "This is your perfection, muscle without mind, strength without pride?" He stepped closer to Father. The coursers flanking the old man tensed, their weapons raised. "You speak of the future," the prince said, looking down at Father, "but you are just a coward hiding in a hole." "We have the technology to save this world," Father insisted, a hint of desperation cracking his composure. "We have the reactor. We have limitless energy." The prince's eyes narrowed. "Reactor?" He looked past Father toward the sector marked Advanced Systems. A deep rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the floor plates, a heartbeat of immense power. "You have a star trapped in a bottle," the prince realized. He smiled. "I do not want your future, old man," the prince said, brushing past Father as if he were a ghost. "I want your battery." The hallway to Advanced Systems was a gauntlet of red lasers and screaming sirens. "Warning, intruder in Sector C, lethal force authorized." The automated voice was polite, clinical. The prince walked. He didn't run. He walked with the heavy, inevitable gait of a storm front. Synths, Gen 1 and Gen 2 skeletons, poured out of the side rooms. They marched in unison, firing laser pistols. The prince didn't bother to block. The lasers pinged off his armor, leaving black scorch marks on the white composite. He swatted the robots aside with backhands, shattering their metal skulls, tearing their limbs off. It was like wading through dry twigs. He reached the heavy blast door of the reactor chamber. It was sealed. A foot of reinforced titanium. "Open!" the prince commanded. The door remained shut. "Have it your way." He placed both hands on the metal. He channeled his ki, not into a blast, but into heat. The titanium began to glow, dull red, then bright orange, then blinding white. The metal softened, drooping like wet clay. The prince pushed. His hands sank into the molten door. He ripped it apart, creating a jagged, glowing wound in the wall. He stepped through the molten slag. The reactor room was vast. It was a cathedral of science, catwalk suspended over a deep chasm. And in the center, suspended in a magnetic field, was the beryllium agitator. It was a cylinder of blue light, pulsing with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. It illuminated the room in a cool, aquatic glow. The hum was deafening here, a song of pure fusion. "Beautiful," the prince admitted, the light reflected in his eyes, washing out the black. "Primitive harnessing, but the output, it is sufficient." He walked out onto the central catwalk. "Stop." Two coursers decloaked on the walkway ahead of him. They held heavy plasma rifles. "Target acquired," the first one stated. They fired. Green plasma bolts, hotter than lasers, screamed toward him. The prince moved. He vanished from the naked eye. He reappeared behind the first courser. He grabbed the synth's head and slammed it into the railing. The metal skull crunched. He kicked the second courser in the spine, sending it tumbling over the edge of the catwalk, falling silently into the coolant pool far below. He stood alone before the reactor. The radiation warnings were flashing red onto the consoles, clashing with the soothing blue of the core. Warning, radiation leakage imminent if containment is breached. "I am already poisoned," the prince muttered, looking at his blistered hands. "A little more will not matter." He reached for the activation lever. "The override! Do not do this!" Father's voice crackled over the intercom. "If you remove the core, the facility stabilizers will fail. The Institute will be buried. Thousands of lives!" The prince paused. His hand hovered over the release mechanism. "Thousands of lives," he repeated. He thought of the raiders cooking meat over tires. He thought of the super mutants eating human flesh. He thought of the ghouls rotting in the dark. He thought of this clean, white tomb built on the bones of the world. "They are already dead," the prince said to the air. "They just haven't fallen down yet." He gripped the handle. He pulled. Clang. The magnetic locks disengaged. The hum of the room changed pitch from a steady drone to a rising, chaotic whine. The cylinder, the core, descended. The prince grabbed it. It was heavy, dense. It vibrated in his arms, warm and alive. The blue light of the reactor died. Instantly, the room plunged into darkness, save for the rotating red emergency lights. "Whoop, whoop, whoop! Critical failure!" the automated voice screamed. "Structural integrity compromised! Evacuate! Immediately!" The facility groaned. A deep geological rumble. The ground beneath the prince's feet shifted. Without the power to maintain the structural integrity fields, the massive underground cavern was beginning to collapse under the weight of the city above. Dust began to rain from the ceiling. A pipe burst, spraying coolant steam. The prince clutched the core to his chest. It burned him. The radiation was spiking, but he welcomed it. It was the key. It was the engine. It was escape. "Let it fall," he whispered. He looked up at the ceiling of the reactor chamber. Tons of rock and steel lay between him and the sky. He crouched. The core was awkward, heavy, but he didn't care. He launched. He flew straight up. He smashed through the maintenance walkways. He smashed through the ceiling panels. He smashed through the rock. He was a bullet leaving the chamber of a gun. He tore through the earth, leaving the white city to crumble into the dark. The surface world was quiet. A gray wind pushed dead leaves across the cracked pavement of Cambridge. The ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology stood as a hollow shell, a rotunda of brick and mortar that had long since surrendered its purpose to the decay. A super mutant patrol idled near the courtyard. One picked at a rusted car chassis. Another chewed on a bone that looked suspiciously human. Then the birds stopped singing. The ground did not rumble. It heaved. The asphalt of the courtyard bulged upward, forming a mound of spider-webbing cracks. The super mutants paused, their dull senses finally registering the seismic anomaly. The leader grunted, hefting his board with a nail. Boom! The earth vomited. A geyser of dirt, concrete, and pulverized steel erupted into the sky. It wasn't a natural tremors, it was a puncture wound from below. From the center of the debris cloud, a streak of light shot skyward. It was not the clean white of a dove, but the violent streaking purple of a bruised artery. The prince screamed as he broke the surface. He clutched the beryllium agitator against his chest with both arms. The device was a cylinder of singing death, pulsing with a light so intense it bleached the color from the ruins. It was heavy, dense with the mass of a caged star, and it was hot. His armor was gone in places, melted away by the friction of boring through 200 feet of bedrock. His skin was a map of blisters. The core burned against his exposed flesh, sizzling as it cooked the sweat and blood on his torso. He did not stop at the rooftops. He climbed. Below him, the physics of his exit took their toll. The structural integrity of the underground facility, already compromised by the removal of the reactor, failed completely. The CIT, rotunda, groaned. The brick facade cracked down the middle. Then slowly, majestically, the entire campus imploded. The ground simply gave way. The streets, the buildings, the super mutant patrol, all of it was sucked down into a widening maw of dust. A sinkhole the size of a city block opened up, swallowing the secrets of the Institute into the dark belly of the earth. The prince didn't look back. He leveled off at 2,000 feet. The air here was thinner, freezing cold, cutting against his burns. He flew erratically. His flight path was not a straight line. It dipped and swayed. He was drunk on radiation. The sickness was no longer a nausea. It was a fire in his marrow. His vision was a tunnel of gray static, the edges vibrating with the rhythm of his failing heart. Thump, thump, thump. Hold! He gasped, the wind tearing the word from his lips. He looked down at his hands. They were fused to the agitator, the skin red and raw. He couldn't feel his fingers. He was powering his flight with life force he didn't have, burning the candle at both ends and the middle. The landscape below passed in a blur of brown and gray. The Charles River, the jagged teeth of the city, the rolling hills of dead grass. And then the green. The glowing sea appeared on the horizon, a festering wound on the planet's surface. The radiation storms rolled in majestic, toxic waves. To anyone else, it was hell. To the prince, it was the finish line. He banked left, his body screaming in protest at the G-force. The agitator grew heavier with every second, a lead weight dragging him down toward the soil. "Do not pass out," he hissed through clenched teeth. Blood sprayed from his nose, painting the white cylinder of the reactor core. He aimed for the center of the green storm. He stopped fighting gravity. He let the weight take him. He fell. The crater was exactly as he had left it, a perfect bowl of glass and ash, carved by his arrival. The space pod sat in the center. It was a stark white sphere, alien and clean against the backdrop of absolute filth. Crash. The prince hit the dirt 20 yards from the pod. He didn't land on his feet. He hit the ground like a skipped stone, bouncing once, twice, before skidding to a halt in a furrow of radioactive mud. The beryllium agitator rolled from his grasp, coming to rest against a rock. It hummed softly, its blue light undimmed, mocking him. The prince lay face down. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind hissing through the vents of his armor and the Geiger counter crackle of the atmosphere. He moved his hand. It was a clawing motion. His fingers dug into the dirt. He pulled. He dragged his body forward. His legs were useless, dead weight trailing behind him. He looked up at the pod. It was so close. 10 yards! Move, he commanded his muscles. They disobeyed. His vision went black for a second, then snapped back to a blurry green. The radiation here was intense. He was bathing in it. His cells were unraveling. He looked at the agitator. He needed it. He reached out, grabbing the handle of the core. He groaned, a sound of pure agony, as he pulled the heavy cylinder toward him. He hooked his arm through the handle. He crawled, inch by inch. The dirt scraped his burns. The air tasted of metal and failure. He reached the pod's landing strut. He pulled himself up, using the white metal as a crutch. He slapped the control panel on the exterior hull with a bloody palm. Hiss. The door opened. The interior light was red. Emergency power. The prince tumbled inside, dragging the agitator with him. He collapsed onto the floor of the cockpit. It was cramped. The leather seat was cool. He rolled onto his back. Above him, the main console was dead. Dark. He looked at the maintenance hatch under the dashboard. He kicked it open with his heel. A tangle of wires and alien circuitry spilled out. He sat up, his head spinning. He grabbed the agitator. Fit, he snarled. He jammed the Institute's reactor core into the cavity intended for a Freezer-Tech fusion battery. It didn't fit. The coupling was square. The hole was round. The prince grabbed a bundle of wires, red, blue, green. He stripped the insulation off with his teeth, spitting the plastic coating onto the floor. He twisted the copper strands around the contact points of the agitator. Sparks showered his face. He didn't blink. He forced the cylinder into the housing. He punched it once, twice. Metal sheared. Plastic snapped. He brute forced the advanced technology of Earth into the advanced technology of the stars. Work! He screamed, slamming his fist into the core one last time. A deep, resonant vibration shook the pod. The red emergency lights flickered and turned white. The console lit up. Screens scrolled with data in a sharp, angular alien script. Power levels, 4,000%. Atmospheric scrubbers, engaged. A vent above his head opened. Whoosh. White mist sprayed down. It wasn't water. It was a decontamination agent, a hyper-oxygenated medical gas used to treat soldiers after planetary purges. The prince inhaled. It felt like ice water poured down a scorched throat. The gas hit his skin. The blisters stopped weeping. The redness began to recede. Inside his body, the scrubbers in the air filtration system began to pull the heavy isotopes out of his lungs, filtering the poison. He slumped back against the pilot's seat. The crushing weight on his chest lifted. The static in his head, the constant biting noise of the wasteland, was silenced by the thick insulated hull of the pod. Silence. Clean, hermetically sealed. Silence. He closed his eyes. He listened to the hum of the engine. It was a steady, aggressive purr. A sound of power. A sound of home. He lifted his hand. The trembling had stopped. The skin was still pink and tender, but the strength, the hydraulic pressure of his key was returning. The blockage was clearing. He looked out the viewport. Outside, the green fog of the glowing sea swirled against the glass. A deathclaw wandered into the crater, sniffing the air, confused by the sudden surge of power. The prince watched it. He felt no anger, no need to fight. He reached for the launch sequence initiator. "Computer," he said. His voice was strong again, rough but commanding. "Plot a trajectory. Destination, Outpost 4. The computer chirped. Trajectory plotted. Estimated travel time, 8 months. Cryostasis recommended. "Initiate pre-flight check," the prince ordered. He leaned his head back against the headrest. He watched the deathclaw scratch at the hull of his ship. "You are lucky," he whispered to the beast through the glass. "I am leaving your graveyard." He watched the readouts climb. The beryllium agitator was unstable, providing jagged spikes of energy, but the pod's converters were smoothing it out. It was enough. He was the prince of all Saiyans, and he was alive. The warning klaxons inside the pod were not the screeching, panic-inducing sirens of the Institute. They were low, rhythmic pulses, a heavy thrum that vibrated in the prince's chest cavity. "Energy output unstable," the console text flashed in jagged alien script. "Foreign power source detected." The beryllium agitator, jammed into the fusion housing with stripped wires and brute force, was singing. It wasn't a clean harmony. It was a chaotic, fluctuating scream of energy that threatened to melt the intake manifold. The prince sat in the pilot's chair, his hands gripping the control sticks. The leather creaked under his grip. He felt the raw vibration of the engine beneath him, a sleeping dragon waking up in a bad mood. He looked through the circular viewport. The crater outside was no longer empty. They had come. Drawn by the pillar of light, or perhaps the scent of the reactor, the scavengers of the wasteland had converged. To the south, emerging from the green fog, came the remnants of the Brotherhood. A single smoking vertibird limped through the air, its rotors chopping unevenly. Beneath it, a squad of knights in T-60 armor marched, their steel shells battered, scorch marks from the airport battle still fresh on their plating. They moved with a desperate, heavy gait. To the north, the wildlife. Deathclaws, a pack of them, and beneath them, scurrying like roaches, a swarm of rad scorpions. The natural and the artificial united in their desire to tear him apart. The prince watched them through the thick tempered glass. It was like looking at an ant farm. "Predictable," he murmured. A laser beam struck the hull. Ping. It was a pitiful sound. The pod's shields, fueled by the agitator's manic output, absorbed it without a flicker. Outside, a knight stepped forward, perhaps a paladin. He raised a heavy laser Gatling gun. He shouted something, his voice lost to the vacuum seal of the pod, mouth moving behind a visor. He pointed at the prince. The prince didn't read lips. He didn't care to. The vertibird pivoted, aiming its nose cannon. The deathclaws charged, their claws tearing up the radioactive soil, ignoring the Brotherhood in favor of the glowing white sphere. They were all rushing toward him. A tidal wave of rust, meat, and desperation. The prince's hand hovered over the launch initiator. It was a simple red button under a glass safety cover. He could kill them. He could step out. He could tap into the agitator's overflow, channel it through his hands, and erase this entire crater. He could turn the glowing sea into a glass parking lot. It would be easy. It would be satisfying. His finger twitched. Then he stopped. He looked at the paladin screaming in silent rage. He looked at the Deathclaw lunging with mindless hunger. "No," the prince whispered. He flipped the safety cover up. "You are not warriors. You are debris. To kill them would be to acknowledge them. To grant them a death at the hands of the prince of all Saiyans was an honor they had not earned. They were not enemies. They were part of the landscape. They were just dirt." He pressed the button. Ignition. The pod didn't lift gently. The beryllium agitator dumped its entire localized charge into the gravitic thrusters in 1 microsecond. There was no fire. There was only force. A sphere of pure kinetic pressure expanded from the base of the pod. The ground of the crater didn't just crack, it liquefied. The dirt was instantly compressed into a hard ceramic bowl. The shock wave hit the attackers. The Deathclaws were not thrown, they were flattened. Their bones shattered instantly under the atmospheric displacement, their bodies pasted into the mud. The Brotherhood Knights fared no better. The shock wave hit the power armor, crumpling the steel suits like aluminum cans. The paladin with the Gatling gun vanished in a cloud of dust and shrapnel. The limping vertibird was caught in the updraft, flipped upside down, and slammed into the cliff face with a crumpled screech of metal. The prince didn't see the carnage. He was already gone. He was pressed back into his seat, the G-force hitting him like a physical blow. His vision grayed at the edges, the skin of his face pulled back. The pod shrieked as it tore through the atmosphere. The green fog of the glowing sea whipped past the glass in a blur, then vanished. The sky shifted, from the sickly bruised yellow of the wasteland clouds to a dull, smoggy gray. And then, suddenly, violently, blue. The dark, rich blue of the upper stratosphere. The shaking stopped. The roaring of the air friction died away, replaced by the smooth, high-pitched whine of the life support systems. The weight on his chest vanished. The prince took a breath. It was deep, easy. His blood, scrubbed of the heavy isotopes, flowed freely. He floated slightly against the straps of his seat. He was heavy, no more. The silence of space was the only true luxury the universe afforded. The pod drifted, rotating slowly on its axis. The chaotic signals of the surface, the radiostatic, the radiation, the screaming of the dying, were gone. Here there was only the cold vacuum and the steady, rhythmic blinking of the navigation console. Orbit achieved, the computer displayed. Course set, Outpost 79, hyper-sleep chamber prepping. The prince unbuckled his harness. He floated up from the chair, weightless. His white boots tapped gently against the ceiling of the small craft. He drifted to the viewport. Below him hung the earth. It was hideous. From this height, the damage was undeniable. It wasn't the blue marble he had seen on other worlds. It was a scarred brown rock. Massive storms of green radiation swirled over the continents like gangrene. The oceans were a murky sludge gray. The cities were just scabs of rust on the surface. "Ugly," the prince sneered, his voice echoing in the small metal sphere. "A rot in the galaxy." He placed his hand against the glass. The urge rose in him, ancient, biological, undeniable. The Saiyan instinct. He had conquered this world? No, he had survived it. He had wrestled with its filth and won. But the existence of the planet itself felt like an insult. It was a witness to his weakness. It was the place where Vegeta had vomited blood, where he had hidden in a cave, where he had been poisoned by the air. As long as this rock spun, his humiliation existed. He raised his right hand. He pointed his palm at the brown sphere below. He gathered his energy. It flowed easily now. The sickness was gone, filtered out by the pod's medical scrubbers. His ki responded instantly, a golden white aura flaring around his body in the zero-gravity cabin. "I should burn you to ash," he whispered, "fireworks for the journey." A ball of energy began to form in his palm. Small, condensed, but powerful enough to crack the tectonic plates. He aimed for the glowing green storm he had just left. One shot to the core, a chain reaction. He could turn the planet into asteroid dust. He watched the world turn beneath him. He saw the faint, flickering lights of the Institute's ruins, the Brotherhood's fires. He imagined them looking up, seeing the second sun forming in the sky, realizing in their final moment that their war was nothing but children playing in the dirt. The energy ball grew. The pod hummed, the internal lights dimming as he drew power. Then he paused. He looked at the energy in his hand. Then he looked at the dead world. He remembered the raider with the pipe pistol, the robot throwing a football, the scientist hiding in a hole. Why, he asked himself. To destroy it was to attribute value to it. To destroy it was to admit that it mattered, that it was a threat worthy of removal. It wasn't a threat. It was a garbage dump. You don't declare war on a landfill. You don't waste a Gallic gun on a compost heap. Waste of energy, the prince muttered. He closed his hand. The energy ball fizzled out, dissipating into harmless light that washed over the interior of the pod. He lowered his arm. The golden aura faded. He turned his back on the earth. He kicked off the wall, floating toward the rear of the compartment. The cryo chamber was waiting. It was a vertical coffin of glass and steel. He punched the activation code into the keypad. Hiss. The glass door slid open. Cold white mist spilled out, swirling around his boots. The prince stepped inside. The interior was padded, smelling of sterile gas. He settled into the mold, crossing his arms over his chest. "Computer," he said, "wake me when we reach civilized space, and if we pass any planets with intelligent life. Keep flying, I have had enough of conversation." Affirmative. The glass door slid shut, sealing with a pneumatic thud. The freezing gas began to fill the chamber. It started at his feet, numbing them, then rose to his chest. The prince watched the viewport one last time. The brown curve of the earth was slipping out of view as the pod's thrusters fired, pushing him away into the black. His eyes felt heavy. The anger, the pride, the radiation. It all slowed down, frozen in the amber of cryostasis. He didn't think about the Brotherhood. He didn't think about the Institute. He thought about a training room. Gravity set to 500x. Clean air. Strong robots. Finally, he breathed, the frost coating his lips. The darkness took him. Not the black of death, but the peaceful, dreamless black of the void. The pod accelerated, a tiny white speck disappearing into the sea of stars, leaving the wasteland to rot in its own silence.